For decades, the Congolese military has been crippled by corruption, mismanagement, and chronic underfunding, making it one of Africa's most ineffective fighting forces. Despite its vast size, the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the FARDC, has repeatedly failed to contain rebel movements, most notably the M23 rebellion, which continues to wreak havoc in eastern Congo. This failure is rooted in historical neglect, poor training, outdated equipment, and deep-seated political interference. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at the structural weaknesses of the Congolese army that have allowed M23 to resurge and threaten national stability. The first Congolese military force, the Force Publique, was formed in August 1888 during the period when King Leopold II ruled the Congo as his personal possession. Like many other colonial armies, it was commanded by European officers while Congolese soldiers served in the lower ranks. However, the Belgian administration made no effort to train local officers, ensuring that the military remained entirely dependent on foreign leadership until the final years of colonial rule. When independence was declared on June 30, 1960, the Force Publique remained unchanged, still under European command. Congolese soldiers who had long been excluded from leadership roles expected immediate promotions and greater authority. Their frustration boiled over on July 5, 1960, when Belgian commander Lieutenant General Emil Janssen declared that nothing would change despite independence. His remarks triggered a mutiny as enlisted troops saw this as a continuation of colonial rule. In an attempt to restore order, Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba announced a one-rank promotion for all soldiers, but this failed to calm the unrest. As tensions escalated, the Belgian population fled the country, and fearing total collapse, Belgium deployed troops without Congo's consent. This reinforced suspicions within the Congolese leadership that Belgium was attempting to reassert control over its former colony. Determined to establish sovereignty, Patrice Lumumba dismissed more than 1,000 European officers, retaining only a small group of advisors. In their place, he promoted Congolese non-commissioned officers, most of whom lacked proper military training. The Force Publique was rebranded as the Armée Nationale Congolaise, but instead of creating a unified national army, it fragmented into disorderly factions. Rather than serving the central government, many units pledged loyalty to ethnic leaders or secessionist movements, turning what was supposed to be a national military force into competing armed groups, each driven by personal and regional interests. In 1965, following years of political turmoil, Joseph Désiré Mobutu, later known as Mobutu Sese Seko, then Army Chief of Staff, seized power in Congo for the second time, having already orchestrated a coup in 1960. Once firmly in control, Mobutu rebranded the country as Zaire in 1971, establishing a regime where the privileged flourished while the majority struggled. Under Mobutu's rule, the Congolese National Army was renamed the Zairean Armed Forces, but rather than strengthen it, he subjected it to constant purges, political manipulation, and frequent reorganizations. Officers seen as potential threats, particularly those from Kasai and Kivu, were sidelined, while loyalists from his own ethnic group, the Bangala of Equator Province, were promoted. Mobutu's paranoia deepened following suspected coups in 1975 and 1978. Convinced that a strong army posed a direct threat to his rule, Mobutu deliberately weakened its structure while selectively empowering elite military units. These units, largely composed of soldiers from northern Equator, were kept close to the capital to protect Mobutu's regime, while the rest of the army was neglected and underfunded. For most Zairean soldiers, survival was a daily struggle. Officers embezzled wages, and unpaid soldiers, left with no alternative, resorted to extorting civilians to get by. Rather than investing in a professional military, Mobutu embraced corruption, allowing his commanders to build personal business empires as long as they remained loyal. Over time, many generals became businessmen rather than military leaders, further eroding discipline and operational effectiveness. The same corruption and lack of discipline that had plagued the army since independence ultimately sealed its fate when Laurent Désiré Kabila launched his rebellion in 1996. By the time his forces reached the capital in 1997, Mobutu's army had all but collapsed. Laurent Désiré Kabila quickly adopted the autocratic playbook of his predecessor, governing through coercion and corruption while growing increasingly paranoid about threats to his rule. One of his deepest fears was betrayal by his former Rwandan allies, the very forces that had helped him topple Mobutu. Just over a year into his presidency, Kabila took a drastic step. He ordered all Rwandan troops to leave the country. This move triggered a full-scale regional conflict. At the center of this war was Congo's weak and disorganized military. Kabila's army was largely made up of young, inexperienced child soldiers known as Kadogos that had been recruited during his rebellion. Lacking training, discipline, and trust in their commanders, they were no match for the well-equipped, battle-hardened rebel groups backed by Rwanda and Uganda. With this regime on the verge of collapse, Kabila was rescued by Angola, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, whose troops arrived with attack helicopters, armored vehicles, and MiG fighter jets, tipping the balance in his favor for a time. Laurent Kabila's rule ended abruptly on January 16, 2001, when he was assassinated inside his presidential palace in Kinshasa. His 29-year-old son, Joseph Kabila, was quickly installed as president, inheriting a war-ravaged nation still locked in conflict. In December 2002, the Global and Inclusive Agreement was signed by the key factions involved in the Second Congo War, marking a significant step toward ending years of bloodshed. The agreement was built on a power-sharing framework, allowing former warring groups to be integrated into state institutions, while their armed factions were merged into a newly formed national army. This led to the creation of the Armed Forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the FARDC, merging the disparate militias that had once fought against each other. While intended to stabilize the country, this arrangement sowed the seeds of future divisions within the military. Appointments within the FARDC were not based on military experience or merit, but rather on political considerations. Commanders were selected for their loyalty rather than their competence, creating an army where personal connections mattered more than battlefield strategy. At the same time, rather than fostering a cohesive and independent army, President Joseph Kabila managed the security forces through informal networks, often bypassing the official military hierarchy. Some elite units, such as the Shark Brigade, operated almost exclusively under Kabila's direct control, leading to confusion and frustration among FARDC officers, many of whom complained about conflicting orders, one from their military superiors, the other from the president. One of the most glaring failures of the Congo's military integration occurred in 2009 when the National Congress for the Defense of the People, the CNDP, was incorporated into the FARDC. While the CNDP was officially absorbed into the National Army, in reality, it continued to operate as a parallel force with its own leadership and command structure. Instead of dissolving, it strategically expanded its influence, securing mineral-rich territories in eastern Congo. This failed integration directly led to the formation of M23 in 2012. Since 2003, international donors made multiple attempts to reform and professionalize the armed forces of the Congo. Despite these efforts, however, Congo's military remains undisciplined, ineffective, and deeply corrupt, with chronic mismanagement and underfunding leaving it in a state of perpetual dysfunction. One of the most glaring weaknesses of the FARDC is its lack of modern equipment. While rebel groups like M23 have access to superior weapons and logistical support, the Congolese military is poorly armed and ill-prepared for combat. Beyond operational failures, corruption runs deep within the FARDC, with soldiers often going months without pay. Desperate to survive, they extort civilians, engage in smuggling, or impose illegal taxes at checkpoints. Some of these extortion networks generate as much as $250,000 per month, with little, if any, of the money reaching state coffers. Shockingly, some FARDC commanders have been caught directly aiding the very rebels they are supposed to fight. There are credible reports of weapons and ammunition being supplied to insurgent factions, raising serious concerns about where the army's true loyalties lie. In one particularly brazen act of collusion, it is alleged that a commander ordered his troops to fire warning shots into the air, signaling to rebels in the forest that the army was approaching, thus giving them enough time to flee unchallenged. Like many state employees in the Democratic Republic of Congo, soldiers in the armed forces endure difficult living and working conditions. Despite some improvements in salary payments, the official monthly wage of around $100 remains insufficient to support even a small family. As a result, many troops and their families live in poverty, relying on side jobs, informal networks, or even illegal activities to survive. FARDC soldiers are not entitled to paid leave, and securing time off is extremely difficult, especially for those stationed in combat zones. Even when permission is granted, visiting family is often impossible due to high travel costs and poor infrastructure. The instability of army life takes a heavy toll on soldiers' families, particularly wives and children. Many military spouses follow their husbands to distant postings, living in makeshift shelters inside military camps, often without proper security or basic amenities. These unprotected settlements leave them vulnerable to attacks by armed groups, disease, and extreme poverty. The dire conditions within the FARDC have led to a rise in desertion and criminal behavior among soldiers. In July 2024, 27 soldiers abandoned their positions in the villages of Kesege and Matembe. They were later caught stealing goods from local shops, and among those arrested were 4 of their wives who had received stolen items. These incidents have resulted in harsh military crackdowns. In May 2024, several Congolese soldiers and officers were sentenced to death for cowardice and fleeing the enemy after a trial in Goma. While the government claimed these actions were meant to enforce discipline, human rights activists argue that soldiers were being scapegoated for deeper systemic failures. The weakness of the Congolese military has allowed M23 and other rebel groups to thrive, exposing the government's growing dependence on foreign forces, mercenaries, and irregular militias. Until the FARDC undergoes major structural reforms, the cycle of rebellion, military failure, and external intervention will likely continue, leaving Congo, especially the eastern part, trapped in endless instability. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.